conference, and this is such a really cool format for a conference because it means that we can come across boundaries and geographic borders to collaborate and learn together. And that's a little bit of what I'll be talking about today, crossing borders. I'll be talking about my reflections on relocating as a sign language interpreter. These are my personal experiences and perspectives. And as we go, I'll be talking about not just the linguistic considerations, but also relearning how to show up, connect, and navigate cultural expectations. I am, as was mentioned, based in the UK. I've been here for well over a decade, but as you can tell by my accent, which stubbornly refuses to change, I'm originally from the US. I've been qualified as a ASL interpreter for almost going on 20 years and as a BSL interpreter for a little over a decade. As I talk about relocating and reestablishing as a sign language interpreter and working between different cultural and geographic contexts, I think that several elements may resonate with you, regardless of whether you've ever had to relocate geographically or not. And in that vein, I have a question for you today in the Interact app on the conference platform. So as I get going, I'm explaining a little bit about my background and where I come from, so you have a context to understand my perspectives. You can navigate to the conference platform and find the question in the Interact part of that on the platform. The question is, have you ever had to reestablish your professional identity in a new setting? Now, this could be a geographic move, but it could also be entering a new domain or taking on a new role where the people you're working with don't know your background. That feeling of being experienced, but still new. And that's what I want to ask about today is, have you ever experienced that? Please let us know in the Interact part of the app. It's a yes, no, or not sure answer. So as you find that, I'll just explain a little bit about where I started and where I am now to give you some context. I did not actually start where that arrow starts. I started much further south in Texas, where there is a small deaf school called the Southwest College for the Deaf. And right there is where we have our first cultural difference, because the word college in the US is often used interchangeably with university. It's a tertiary education. College means something a little bit different here in the UK. Also important to understand is that in the US, a bachelor's degree generally takes 4 years, whereas in the UK, it may take about 3. So very often a college is a smaller institution that offers a 2-year degree, and then you can continue to maybe a bigger institution like a university and get a 4-year degree. And that's what I did. So the Southwest College for the Deaf, where I grew up, had an interpreter training program. And because there were a lot of deaf people in my community and I saw them signing, I was intrigued. I went to the college. I fell in love with the culture and the language through the immersive experience I had there, and transferred to a very similar institution on a much bigger scale, Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C., which is a university for the deaf, where I got my bachelor's degree. And I worked at Gallaudet and in Washington, D.C. for several years. And one summer I went traveling in Argentina and climbed a mountain, as you do. And I met this really cool British guy. And a year and a half later, I was married and I moved to London. And I think that's important to understand, because I often get people asking me, how can I start to work abroad? How does this happen? And for me, it was not a professional strategic decision. Life just kind of picked me up and planted me here. And when it did, I realized very quickly a few things. Obviously, the sign language is different. So I was going to have to learn a new sign language if I wanted to continue in this profession here. And I was fortunate in that I didn't have to learn another spoken language. Not really. There were more differences between British and American English than I expected. So I was new, although I was established in the profession, I was new here, but I didn't have the same cultural grounding. And that experienced but new situation is a strange tension to sit in. And we'll explore that a little bit more as we go. As we all know, interpreting isn't just about language. It's about the culture that lives inside that language. So even though I didn't have to learn a new spoken language, I was still with spoken English, constantly tripping over idioms that were unfamiliar to me, like the dog's breakfast or not seeing somebody for donkey's years. All of these things didn't have any meaning to me and sounded very new and strange. Pacing was different. And even within the sign languages, the facial grammar at times was slightly different. With the sign languages, as an ASL user, I realized very quickly that things that felt very intuitive and obvious, maybe even a little iconic to me, were not intuitive or obvious to a BSL user. So all of these things really made me slow down, ask a lot more questions, and check my assumptions. Here we have our question in the Interact app, which I hope you have had a little bit of time to look at. This is really just thinking about the times when you've been the newcomer, even if you've had years of experience. Are we able to pull up anything we have in that poll yet? Yes. So many of you know what it feels like to sit in that uncomfortable tension of being experienced but new. And here's the heart of it. What I really would encourage you to think about is, what did that navigation require? Did it mean learning a new system where you had to learn new protocols, maybe get new or different credentials? Was it more interpersonal, where you had to learn new communication norms or different ways to connect and be seen and ask questions without overstepping? Or was it more emotional work, where you had to wrestle with self-doubt, remaining open to growth, and rebuilding confidence? Or was it a little bit of all of those things? And that's really what I want to hone in on today, not just linguistic differences of working across borders or across cultures, but the cultural, systemic, and emotional considerations of doing that. Thanks for the poll. Can we go back to the slides? Thank you. So when I moved over, even though I was a certified ASL interpreter, of course I knew I was going to have to learn another sign language, but it also became apparent that to become a qualified BSL interpreter, I was going to have to go through an interpreter training program again, because my qualifications were not recognized here. And that was difficult, not because I wasn't willing to do it, but because it made me feel like my experience didn't matter that much. And I thought, if I am an interpreter, why do I have to become one again? And that tension between competence and recognition really shaped my early months here, and it still echoes in how I think about legitimacy and confidence. I think it's interesting to just briefly do a comparison of the two credentialing systems in the two countries, because it really highlights that credentialing itself is a cultural construct. So within the US, different states, different geographic regions might have their own quality assurance or credentialing systems, but there's a nationally recognized system. At the time I took it, it was through the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, RID. It's now administered through the Center for the Assessment of Sign Language Interpreting. But essentially, it's a test-based certification. You take the test and you're certified. That test has two parts. One is about knowledge, interpreting theory, linguistics, deaf culture, ethics. And the second part is more about your signing and interpreting skills. So ASL to English and vice versa. There's also transliteration, which is a term I heard often in the States, but here less often here. It just means working between signed English and spoken English. And then they also give you a few hypothetical ethical situations and these little vignettes. And these are sticky ethical situations. And they want you to answer what you would do in this sticky ethical situation by citing the exact tenets of the code of ethics to which your answer applies. So that's the test. And once you pass it, you're certified. Now, theoretically, you could just walk in and take the test, but it's typically preceded by 2 to 4 years of full-time training. That sounds like a long time. It's important for me to explain in my experience that interpreter training was coinciding with still learning ASL, still learning the language, which is a bit different than here. I had 90 hours of structured observation and feedback where I would watch fully certified interpreters work, ask them questions about their sign choices. They would watch me work, give me feedback, and shadowing of working interpreters was very common. When I moved to Washington, D.C., it was very common for me to show up at a job and have a student interpreter that was there. All parties had agreed to this, of course. But usually the shadowing was facilitated either by established interpreters or agencies. And it was done quite frequently. When I moved to the UK, there's NRCPD or RBSLI, Signature, IBSL. All of it is more portfolio based with recorded submissions and written reflections. My interpreter training was delivered over 8 weekends, and that sounds like perhaps you're getting less than these full-time years of training, but actually you already get your language qualifications before you start on the interpreting part. I had tutor observation, written feedback, lots of peer feedback in those weekends, but I found that shadowing was not typically facilitated by agencies. I reached out to several agencies in London asking for shadowing opportunities, and they all seemed a bit baffled by the request. And many said, well, when you get your trainee badge, get back to us and we'll put you to work. And that kind of threw me because I wasn't looking for opportunities to work. I was looking for opportunities to watch people work. But that was the moment when I realized that I really needed to lean into the pathway that was here instead of trying to recreate the pathway that I was used to. And this is the interesting thing about credentialing systems, because even though these are very different systems, they both led to me being recognized as a qualified interpreter. And that can make you ask how much of our sense of legitimacy comes from the culture of training and not just the credential itself. Because credentialing isn't neutral. It's a reflection of what a profession believes is important, whether it's test scores or tick boxes. Each system encodes cultural assumptions about learning and readiness and legitimacy. And when you shift countries, those assumptions have to shift too. Even after I got credentialed, I realized that was just the start. The way interpreting is practiced here, like the how of the job, was shaped by a different set of professional norms, from booking systems and how much prep you ask for, how much prep you might expect to get versus just kind of showing up and figuring it out. The access to work system through the government here was very new to me and took a lot of learning and negotiation. In the States, I co-worked quite frequently, and here I co-work far less. I felt that when I asked for feedback in my experiences in the States, I was given feedback. And I felt that when I asked for feedback in my early experiences here, it didn't come as easily or as much. So I was very keen to get feedback on my BSL production because I knew it had to be tinged heavily with ASL influence. And when I had the opportunity to co-work, I was often asking for, please let me know what signs don't look right or what might not even be BSL signs. And I think I had one interpreter give me some feedback on that. So that was a bit different. Also the rates. So in Washington, D.C., I charged a 2-hour minimum with an hourly rate on top of that. And when I moved here, it was all charged in half days and full days. And it was interesting to know what to charge because this was before the Nubsley fee guidance came out. And I didn't really have an established professional network yet. So I didn't really have a lot of people to ask when I first arrived. And I sent my details out to a lot of agencies in London and said, hey, I'm an ASL interpreter here, fully qualified. Here's my CV. And I was lucky enough to pick up some ongoing ASL work through an agency. And I think fortunately with my past experience with agencies, I was very trusting that that agency was going to give me a fair rate. And I worked that job for 8 months before I found out that they were actually paying me less than they would pay a BSL trainee interpreter. And it just took me that long to kind of develop a professional network and start asking questions. So it's important to develop those networks with colleagues if you're getting reestablished. So it wasn't just about learning a new system, it was about adjusting to how I moved through that system. There are of course, things that get lost in translation. The things you would expect, like linguistic misunderstandings and differences. One example was during my interpreter training weekends, very low stakes environment when I was interpreting with my peers, and I was interpreting a video of a guy in an office setting talking about putting up a poster, and he couldn't find the thumbtacks to put up the poster. And everyone in the room was like, what's a thumbtack? And I didn't have any other word for it. So, we did some Googling. The interpretation went completely off the rails. We did some Googling and they're okay, we would call those drawing pens. I don't know what that is. So it was about finding the lexical label for this object. So we had a shared understanding. Those types of things happened less the longer I was here and the more familiar I became with British English. But there were other things that went a lot deeper that weren't so easy to gloss over. And which may be more applicable to a lot of everyday interpreters' work in community settings. For example, gaps in world knowledge or cultural understanding. I had a VRS call soon after I qualified where the lady was, I still don't even understand what was happening. Something about a credit card scheme and getting money back. And she expected me to know what she was talking about. And we called the credit card company and I was calling thinking, this isn't a thing. Oh, it's a thing. And the whole conversation and the assumed knowledge that I should have to facilitate this conversation just wasn't there for me. And I ended up transferring that call to a colleague who was born and raised British, had been here for several years, obviously was familiar with whatever it was they were talking about and could seamlessly take on that conversation and interpret it much better than I could. So sometimes it's about recognizing where those gaps are in culture or world knowledge or whatever it is, and passing that to an interpreter who may be more apt to handle it well. And then there are things that are also very nuanced, but are so ingrained as a cultural norm that they have to be slowly learned. An example of that is when I was working at an office in London, and the boss wanted to start his meeting, and one of the staff members was late, and he was kind of antsy about getting started. And she finally walked in, and as she walked in the door, he asked her, "Are you okay?" And her response was, "Sorry, my train was late." And I was lost. I didn't understand how we got from "Are you okay?" to "Sorry, my train was late." Because at that point, if I had walked into a room, even if I was late, and somebody had said, "Are you okay?" I would have answered the question. I would have said, "Yes, I'm fine, thank you." I did not understand that he was asking why she was late. And it was at that moment that I really started to understand how much in British English and cultural communication norms is kind of set underneath the surface. And so it's about reading between the lines, but you also have to know what the lines are that you're supposed to read between. And when we are raised in a culture, we just know that stuff. It feels very natural, very intuitive. We do it subconsciously. But when you're moving into a different culture, you may not even be aware it's there. And so it's about bringing awareness to it and then maintaining that awareness as you learn where those lines are and how to read between them, and realizing that your own communication style may be perceived differently. So a more explicit communication style, which is what I was more used to from where I grew up and where I was from, often seemed to be a bit off-putting to people when I was communicating here. And that's an extra layer that you have to think about as you are creating an interpretation. It's a nuance about how will this person I'm interpreting for be perceived if I don't consciously, perhaps, start to at least think about some of these perceptions that might be behind communication norms and communication styles. So these little moments, funny or awkward, are really powerful teachers if we're open to learning from them. But to learn from them, we also have to be open and aware enough to recognize them. Of course, I had to become involved with the local deaf community, build trust with that community. And my pathway to involvement was different here. In the US, I was very fortunate in that just by the nature of the educational institutions I was attending, I was immediately immersed in the culture because they were deaf schools. Here, I had to seek out those opportunities beyond my BSL classes. So deaf pup nights, I worked as a teacher's assistant at a deaf school, and talking about cultural differences. It's often said that the deaf culture is much more forward, perhaps a bit more blunt than hearing cultures in general. And this is where I got the best feedback on my signs without even asking for it. I was often told, nope, that signed wrong. Nope, you did that wrong. And I was very appreciative of it. So that was really integral to not only establishing myself as a member of the profession and the community here and building that trust, but also honing my language skills. So earlier I asked if anybody had ever felt like in that situation where they are experienced but new. And it's clear that I'm not alone there. That's something that many people have experienced over the course of their profession. That feeling of how do I belong here? Do I belong here? And shifting into that new role. I think it's important to really name that because it's those moments of starting again that can quietly shake your confidence, even if you are very experienced. And those doubts don't always show up on the surface, but they shape how we show up and how much space we feel we're allowed to take up. So for me, this experience of being qualified and experienced, but also new and unknown, kind of created this imposter syndrome that I hadn't really ever experienced before. And it took a lot of mindset work to remember what I bring while still staying open to growth and growing into that new role. So when everything feels very unfamiliar, it can be useful to think about what anchors you. For me, it was integrity. So working hard and doing what I said I was going to do. Curiosity. So being willing to ask and not assume. Respect for languages and cultures without assuming any type of hierarchy, and reciprocity, because interpreting is a relationship and not a transaction. And these were anchoring for me because they transcend language and transcend culture and transcend boundaries. Practicing cultural humility. Cultural humility isn't about knowing everything about every culture. It's about knowing what you don't know. It's the chance to stay open and check your lens and lead with listening. And instead of asking, how have I always done this? And trying to place that lens into a new situation, experience, or environment, just stepping back enough to remove that lens and look at it and say, how can it be done well here? So the question is, what can you shift? And what might cultural humility look like in your setting? It may be asking someone why something is done a certain way with curiosity, It might be acknowledging and then reflecting on what your own assumptions might be, or it could just be bringing small shifts to bridge cultural gaps. Thank you for holding space for this reflection. If it resonated, I would love to connect with you later, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And just remember, when you're working between worlds, whether that's linguistic, cultural, or professional, you're not alone.